Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar about cross-browser testing. I hope you can hear me all just fine. My name is Daniel and I'm the lead developer at BrowserMall. In today's webinar, we will cover 4 basic points. We will start off with how you can effectively structure your cross-browser test. Then we'll talk about how to decide for which browsers and mobile devices you want to test. We will touch on a few points on how to execute tests efficiently. And last but not least, we will cover some tools or other means to help you get the test done in less time. After the presentation, we will do a Q&A, so feel free to hang around. For an effective test structure, a few different things are important. For one thing, during development of the website or web application, it's the different, not the different structure in essence. You will want to pick one main development browser. If you're working on a team where you have developed websites before, you will know that every developer has some preferences on which browser to use to develop and debug different web features. Now, it doesn't really matter that much which browser you choose, but it will help you a lot if the whole team uses the same development browser. This makes sure that there are no random errors found during development just because the one developer uses another browser than the other developer. But for this to work, you have to test repeatedly. So it's not a good idea to develop a full website or a full web application and do a cross-browser test only after the implementation is finished. I see the. So you have to test during development. You could go on for different structures. You could test after every completed page or every completed feature. You have to decide what will work best for yourself. But you should not wait with the testing until development is finished, mostly because if you find basic things you have to change, it's much harder to change them after the fact. We will go into more details about the test cycle later, but for now, you can best test if you follow a test, fix, repeat cycle. That means for every browser you will test the page or the feature, fix any problems you encounter, and will repeat a test. This makes sure that you don't reintroduce bugs during the testing and during the fixing of the bugs. But how will you go about deciding for which browsers to test? The first thing that you have to keep in mind is that there are too many combinations between browsers and operating systems or browsers and mobile devices. So you cannot just say we will test for every possible combinations our customers use, because this will be so time consuming that there is no time for any development left. Instead of trying to test for each and every combination, I would suggest you test smarter. For this to work, you have to understand that all browsers are based on different so-called rendering engines. There is, for example, the rendering engine Blink, which is used in Google Chrome. But these rendering engines are not always exclusively used in one browser, because creating such a complex rendering engine is a huge undertaking, and many, especially smaller browser vendors, will use the same rendering engine as a big browser vendor, because a vendor like Google can invest the time and the money to create such a rendering engine. And luckily for other browser developers, like, for example, Opera, Google and Apple, for example, have made their rendering engine open source, so it can be used in other browsers. Let's look at the slide here for a second. We can see there are 4 main rendering engines listed here. They are Blink, which is used in Google Chrome and Opera. There is WebKit, which is currently used in Safari for Mac. There is the Gecko engine, which is used in Firefox. And Firefox uses the same rendering engine for different platforms, for example. So if you're running Firefox on Windows, it is running the same rendering engine as it would on OS X or on Linux. And lastly, we have the rendering engine Trident, which is used in Internet Explorer and in a more modern version in the new Edge browser by Microsoft. So what's the key takeaway here is that if you manage to get, let's say, for example, your website or your web application running in Google Chrome, this means that the website will, for once, work in other browsers that are based on the rendering engine Blink. For example, it will work in Opera as well. And there is a very high chance that if your website runs in Google Chrome for Windows, it will run in Chrome for OS X as well. Of course, there are slight differences, especially in font rendering or form controls like buttons between the different operating systems. But as I've said earlier, it's very hard to do a complete test across all operating system and browsers, so you have to decide where to use your resources the best. Because of this, I would always suggest make sure that you're always testing for big rendering engines. These are Blink, WebKit, Gecko, and Trident. But if you don't have the time to test all operating system options, make sure that you're getting a good mix. So for example, test for Blink rendering engine using Google Chrome for Windows, test for WebKit, use Safari on Mac, and so on. This is rather easy to decide. As for the specific versions, I would always suggest to test the latest version. So for example, Google Chrome is now releasing a new version every, I guess it's 6 weeks now. So you will have to constantly test for new versions of Google Chrome if your projects are longer than 6 weeks, for example. On the other hand, we have the Trident engine used by Internet Explorer, which is not updated that often, and Microsoft has put restrictions in place. So if users are using older Windows versions like Windows XP or Windows Vista, they are unable to update their browser to the latest version. So for example, Internet Explorer 11 is only available to users of Windows 7 and up. This means it's not that easy to decide for which Internet Explorer versions you need to test. Because some people say that now that Microsoft has released a new browser called Edge, that Microsoft's Internet Explorer is dead because it's no longer actively developed. But the thing is, the Microsoft Edge browser is only available if you're running Windows 10. If you're running Windows 8 or Windows 7, which are still widely used and it's a perfectly fine choice, mostly because you have to get used to a new Windows version, and as always, not everybody will update their software as soon as possible. So everybody has to decide which Internet Explorer versions he still wants to support. Now that's a question you cannot answer for everybody. The user base for your web project might be different to the user base for my web project. So a good thing to do is to look at your statistics, look at your Google Analytics or at the customer's Google Analytics to see, are there many people using old Internet Explorer versions? Or are they mainly Apple users or whatever the statistics will decide? So you can make a good decision. If there are no statistics available because there's a new web project, I would suggest looking at the budget for once, because the older the Internet Explorer versions get, the more programming you have to do to support them properly. So if you go back to, let's say, Internet Explorer 7, you will have to do much more work to get your modern website running on this browser in comparison to only supporting Internet Explorer 11, for example. Okay, that was for the desktop browsers, but we will also have to test for mobile devices. And of course, the same rules apply. There are many, many more mobile devices than there are desktop browsers and operating system combinations. So if you would only try to attempt to test for every possible combination between iOS, the operating system by Apple, and Apple devices like the iPhone and the iPad, you would get hundreds of different combinations because there is iOS 9 now, iOS 8, 7, and so on. And of course, each iOS version comes with its own browser version, which is a modified version of Safari. So in essence, the same idea applies as with the desktop browsers. You have to pick which mobile operating systems you want to support. And again, you would like to, you should decide which versions of these operating systems apply to you, or more precisely to your user base, or the user base of your web project. So while Apple is fairly good at updating their devices to newer iOS versions, there are still limits on how far their customers can update. So in many cases, it's not enough to just support the latest iOS version, but the latest and the second to latest. It gets a lot more complicated if you go to Android, for example, because there are many device manufacturers like Samsung and many different versions of Android out there. And device manufacturers for Android devices often don't port their specific changes of Android to all new versions of the operating system. So if you buy an Android phone today, you cannot be sure that you will get Android updates from the device manufacturer 2 years from now. So there are quite a few people out there running different Android versions. And of course, different browser versions inside these Android versions. And if you want to take Windows for mobile devices into the mix, it gets even more complicated, and even more different versions are available. So you see, you have to settle on a smaller subset of mobile devices to test, regardless of you want to test with simulators or you want to test with real devices. You will have to restrict yourself even more, because you cannot buy every possible iPhone that's released recently. And we should not forget that, at least for Android and Windows, there are more than the stock browser available. So as you may know, you can, for example, install Firefox or Google Chrome to any iOS device. But these browsers on iOS will not use their specific rendering engine. For example, Google Chrome for iOS will not use the Blink rendering engine, but it will use the underlying Safari rendering engine, which is available on iOS. This means that even though there are different browsers available on iOS, you only really have to test for the stock browser Safari. The picture is a little different if you go to Android, for example, because on Android, if you install Firefox, it will really use the Gecko engine used by the desktop browser Firefox, and not the underlying stock browser engine. So depending on your customers or the user base of your customer, you will have to support, let's say, Firefox for Android or Opera Mini for Android and the likes, just to keep that in mind. Now, we have a basic structure for our test, and you should by now have a clear picture of what browsers and what devices you will test for. If you're doing project for a customer, it's always a good idea to speak about that, about the device selection beforehand, so that you're sure that everybody's on the same page. As for the test execution, I personally like to use a cycle to test. So as I said earlier, for every browser, you will test either a specific feature or you do a full test or a test of one page. It doesn't matter that much. After the test in this one particular browser, you will go and fix any problems you might encounter during the test. And then you will repeat this cycle, because your bug fixes will or could possibly introduce new bugs into the page. So you will test, you will fix, and then you can repeat the test again, and hopefully you don't find any more problems, so the test will be finished for this browser. And you can move on to the next one. So for example, in the example you can see now, you would test for Chrome and repeat this until you don't have any more problems. Then you would move over to Firefox, again, test, fix, repeat, and so on. As for the order of the different browsers, in this example, we have Chrome, Firefox, IE. Here, Chrome is our main development browser and will most likely support every feature. And we will mostly find problems in the browsers the developers don't use during development. We have also decided on this particular order because the more features you have to emulate in the browser, let's say for examples, you don't have the possibility to do CSS shadows in older Internet Explorer versions. So for testing, you would like to start with a browser that supports every feature natively you are using and move back to the browsers that need to have fallback solutions in place or don't support every feature. And how would you go about testing? We can split the necessary testing into two different groups. We have the layout testing and we have the functionality testing. Layout testing is something like you're testing the layout of the page. So are the colors right? Is the text right? Is everything in the right place, and so on. And with functionality, you would really test the links between the different pages. If you have any kind of dynamic content, like sorting of tables, log in, log out, and things like that, you would test as a separate step. In most cases, it's easier to start with testing the functionality because it's easier to get it to work than to look right in every browser. And if something doesn't work, you often have to go back and pause the testing to fix that. Because, for example, if you want to test the layout of the logout page, you will not be able to do so if the login doesn't work. So always try to get test functionality first and layout second. All right. I'm sure you have already noticed that what I've described so far is not very automated, because unfortunately still cross-browser testing is mostly a process you have to do manually. You have to manually test most things. For example, you could potentially test the layout with using screenshots, and you could even compare these screenshots in an automated way. But at some point, someone has to look at these screenshots to make sure that they're not only identical, what you can find out with the tool, but that they're really looking right and making sense. And this also applies to the functionality testing, because you can automate part of the testing, but human still has to test at least occasionally to make sure that it can actually be used by a human being, and not only the automated testing robot can do something. So the question is, how can we make this manual process easier for us and easier to do, faster to do? Because it can get quite boring and quite tedious to do. Of course, there are a few tools available to help you with the testing. The most manual thing to do would be to install all the different browsers on your local machine and test with them. But you have to keep them updated, and you cannot install more than one Internet Explorer version. So that's not an ideal solution. Now you have to understand, there is no one tool that will fit for everybody, for every use case and every need. You have to decide on a few things. For example, there are tools that run online, that run in your browser and is simulating the different browser versions in a virtual machine somewhere in a cloud-hosted server. On the other hand, there are tools which run on your local machine. So there is no data going between your local machine and any external source, which can be a huge plus if you have to test anything with secure data, online banking, for example. Then, of course, you have to decide, do you want to test desktop browsers? Do you want to test mobile devices? Do you want to test both? And if so, do you want to test with the same tool? Or are you open to the idea to use two different tools? One which is designed to help you test for desktop browsers, and one that is designed to help you test mobile devices. Of course, different tools have different capabilities. There's three main things that most tools support. This is live testing, which means the tool will run a specific browser version and you can interact with it just like you would with the browser installed on your local machine. So if you are opening Google Chrome, for example, on your machine, that's a live test for Google Chrome. Then there is screenshot testing, which means that the tool will create screenshots of any website, any web page in a specific browser. So you can later compare these screenshots and find layout issues more quickly. This, of course, will not work very well for the dynamic functionality of any website. So you cannot test the login screen with screenshots alone, but you can test the login screen with a live test. And the third portion of the testing is, of course, automation. There are different tools available that can do automation, either because if you can program tests or you can record them and replay them in different browsers. And lastly, you of course have to decide what is this cross-browser testing tool worth to you? How much time can you save, and how can you justify the costs? Again, different tools will have different amount of pricing. All right, now I would like to show you one of these tools as a quick example. Of course, as I've said, the different features are available in different tools. So this is mostly an example. Let's see. This is, of course, the tool we develop here at BrowserMall. And as you could imagine, we think it's quite good. I will show two different things, or maybe three different things. The first thing, as I've said earlier, is the so-called live test, where the tool will start a specific browser and you can test live functionality and, of course, see the layout. For this example, let's test our homepage, and let's say we'll test for the Chrome version. The tool runs on the local machine, so there's no server interaction, and we can now see how the website is rendered using the latest Chrome version. As you can see, we can see the layout, and we can interact and see if every functionality will work. As for a live test, of course, we want to test different browsers. So let's switch to Firefox real quick. This is how the page looks rendered in Firefox, or using the Gecko rendering engine, as we've learned earlier. And it's possible to use the page and test for different functionality. Now you might want to take screenshots. If you only want to test the different layout versions, you can again do so without running through a live test for every page. Let's see, we'll take Chrome and maybe Firefox again and generate some screenshots. Again, as before, the screenshots are generated on the local machine, so you could potentially test pages that are only hosted locally. You can now see the screenshots in full size. They are full page screenshots, so you can quickly see the layout and see any potential errors. Luckily, I don't see any. Okay, a quick thing I would like to add, which is not supported by many other tools. If you're doing such a live test, you would, as I said, you would iterate across different browsers. If you're in the later stage of a project, you might only want to retest different functionality to make sure it still works. For that, our tool can do a so-called browser compare, which means we will run two or more browsers side by side. For this example, we'll take Chrome and Firefox. And the interesting thing is that now we have the rendering for Chrome on the left side. We have the rendering for Firefox on the right side. And we can, for example, we can interact with them. We can navigate both browsers at once, and the actions we take in the left browser will automatically repeat it on the right side. So for example, if we switch here, we'll automatically switch on the right. That's a handy possibility to test functionality without repeating the steps more than once. You can do these compare sessions for up to 4 browsers side by side. So far for the tool, as I've said, there are different tools available with not identically, but the essentially same feature set. And you have to decide, do you want something that runs on your local machine, on another machine, and so on. Okay, does anybody have any questions so far? You should be able to enter any questions you have on the left side to the screen. Okay, so it was asked if our software will install the different browser versions, or if you have to install them yourself. And for our software specific, there are all browsers included in the software, so you will be able to test for, let's say, Firefox or Chrome, even if they are not installed natively on the machine, because every browser is included in the setup of our software. The only specific case is Internet Explorer, which has to be installed on Windows, but normally it is automatically installed and you shouldn't be missing it. Okay, Anastasia asked if you necessarily need to test without JavaScript enabled, if I understand correctly. And that's an interesting question. And I think it comes down to what user base you're having. But what's always a great idea is to test without JavaScript enabled, just to see how the fallback looks like. Because, for example, the Google bot, which looks at your page for SEO and for ranking, will not necessarily execute JavaScript. So it's always a good idea to give the users a basic fallback. For example, if a functionality is not available without JavaScript, you should at least show a warning to the user and not just show the broken feature. I hope that answers your question. All right, so Jens asked if the different Internet Explorer versions in our tool are, how are they handled? And you may know about the compatibility mode included in Internet Explorer, which means you can, in essence, add a specific meta tag to your website, and it will instruct Internet Explorer to render using an older rendering engine version than the latest one available. So for example, if the user is running Internet Explorer 11 and you know your website is only optimized for Internet Explorer 8, you could potentially add a specific meta tag to instruct Internet Explorer 11 to use the rendering engine of Internet Explorer 8. But they're not the included engine in Internet Explorer 11 for Internet Explorer 8 is not exactly the same as the real engine in Internet Explorer 8, which makes it rather complicated, to say the least. Our software uses the integrated compatibility mode rendering engine, but it will try to smooth over the differences by adding some local changes to the engine. So if you select Internet Explorer 8, for example, in our software, it will not render exactly as the Internet Explorer 8 compatibility mode would, but it tries to render exactly as the real Internet Explorer 8 engine would render. That said, some features are simply not available anymore in the modern Internet Explorer. So you had as an example, there is no native version for Windows 10, for example. So some things will render differently, mainly font rendering, for example, or form elements like buttons, just as between different operating system versions. I hope that answers your question. Anastasia asked how to test different versions of a browser. And that really depends on what tool you're using. If you don't want to use a tool, you could install the one version of the browser on your local machine. For example, you could install the latest Firefox version on your local machine, and you would have to use, let's say, virtual machines like VMware Player or something to run older versions of the browser. There are different virtual machines available for download, especially if you want to test Internet Explorer. You can find them on the Microsoft pages for download, and they're free of charge. Now, if you want to use a tool to test different versions of a browser, I would imagine that they are capable of that. Our tool, for example, comes with different versions of the browsers already installed. So for example, if you would like to test Firefox, different versions of Firefox with our software, you could simply select between Firefox 44, 43, 42 and test with the different versions. Of course, it always depends on what versions of the browser you need to test and which ones are still in use by your user base. I hope that answers the question. Okay, Leon has asked, is it possible to run a test script in your tool with a test automation tool like Tosca? Yes and no. There is a technology called Selenium, which is backed by most browser vendors and can be used to run automated tests, scripts in essence, to validate things in the browser and to automatically test functionality. With our tool, you can run these so-called Selenium tests in the different browsers the tool supports. I'm not familiar if Tosca will be able to generate Selenium tests or Selenium test scripts, but if so, then you will be able to run them using our tool, Browsermall. I hope that answers your question. Are there any more questions? Jens has asked how the iOS Safari testing works in our software, because on Windows, the WebKit version is not available. It works, so as I've said earlier, WebKit is the rendering engine used in Safari, and there once was a Safari version you could install on Windows, but Apple has stopped supporting that on version 5.1, which was quite a while ago. And we do the mobile Safari testing in our tool using a mobile simulator. This simulator uses the a much more current version of WebKit, which we apply a few changes to, so it can run on Windows, because while Apple has stopped supporting their browser on Windows, the WebKit project itself, the rendering engine, is open source, and it can still be compiled and run on Windows. That said, again, it is a mobile simulator, so some details, mainly form elements, will look different, at least slightly different than on the real device. But as far as I know, the iOS simulator, or emulator more precisely, doesn't fully emulate the Safari on OS X as well. So if you don't want to use any simulator or emulator for mobile testing, you will have to either get the real device or get a service like Perfecto Mobile to get remote access to real devices. Anastasia asked if there's a trial version available, and you should be able to see the download link on the right, or you can go to our page at browsermall.com and download the free trial, which lets you test it for 2 weeks. The next question is there a way to minimize the top ribbon in Browsermall? Now let's bring the software back up real quick. Okay, I'm not really sure what you mean with the top ribbon. I guess you mean the navigation bar at the top here. It's currently not possible to minimize that. And if we, for example, start a live test again, you can see that the window is now smaller than if you would use a real browser, because of course this navigation is not there on, let's say, Google Chrome. But you can still select different resolutions here, and it will change the browser window to the new settings, ignoring the above ribbon. Is there any other specific reason you want to remove the top navigation? Maybe you could clarify. Is there any free tool available? As I said earlier, the virtual machines from Microsoft are free to use. Other than that, there is the service browsershots.org, which can create different screenshots in different browsers. I'll copy the link in the chat. Unfortunately, while this tool is free, there is no Internet Explorer available for it. So you could do screenshots in Chrome, Firefox, Opera, but most Internet Explorer versions are either unavailable or it takes a really, really long time to get any screenshots. That said, this version is free to use for everybody. As far as I know, there are no other free tools available, but you could get by with using free trials, for example, our free trial, of course, and most other tool vendors will offer a free trial as well. Are there any more questions? No more questions? No problem. Okay, it was asked to how could you best test for Safari on OS X if you don't have access to a Mac? This is a tricky question because currently the Safari is not available on any other operating system than Mac. And I don't have any good suggestions on how to test for Safari without using a Mac. that said, as I've said, the rendering engine behind Safari can still be compiled to run on Windows, and we hope to integrate the current rendering engine which powers Safari for Windows in our tool in one of the next releases. But you would still have some slight differences like font rendering and form elements, buttons, etc., etc. Unfortunately, there's really no good other way to test for Safari at the moment, other than having a Mac. Any more questions? John has asked about the Edge browser, and currently our tool only supports the Edge browser for taking screenshots. So in the browser comparison, unfortunately, it will not yet work, as you've experienced. And of course, as I've said earlier, Microsoft had put the restriction on Microsoft Edge to only run on Windows 10. So our tool is unable to run Edge on any older only any older Windows versions. We are working on bringing Edge to the live testing and comparison as well, but in the foreseeable future, it will only be available on Windows 10, unfortunately. Anybody else, any questions? To test mobile browsers, if you have access to the real hardware, of course, that's the best solution to test. If that's not possible, because you either have to test for a specific device your customer wants or needs, or if that's not an option, you can use an emulator, but as far as I know, they're not 100% identical to the real device. So I would always recommend doing a test with the real hardware prior to going live. There are different services which will host the mobile devices for you. I would, for example, suggest Perfecto Mobile, which has a very big range of devices you can access through your browser. But of course, testing that way will not give you any developer tools. So the real device could be debugged over USB, for example, if you're using Chrome. If you want to test iOS and Safari, you will have to make do without developer tools on the mobile device or on your machine. And of course, services like Perfecto Mobile will also not give you any developer tools. You will just have to use the try and error testing method. Any more questions? All right, so minimizing the ribbon in our software would give you more screen space, I guess. As you can see here on the top navigation. I will add that to our possible feature list. See if it gets done shortly. Thank you for this suggestion. Anybody else? Any questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, thank you all. for taking the time. And if anybody wants to, of course, you can try our tool for free for 14 days and maybe fix some cross-browser bugs along the way. Thank you very much.